Now I invite Professor Prabhu Guptara. He is a visiting fellow at the Judd Business School, Cambridge University, and chairman of SALT Research Media Group. Professor Guptara, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Abraham. Very kind of you to have invited me to speak on the Indian diaspora in Europe. And I think it might be useful to give a little bit of a historical perspective before we come to what the situation is today, because I'm afraid most people, including our distinguished people here on the webinar at the moment, may not be fully aware of the history. So let me start with the UK, because we have the largest number of people of Indian origin here. Current estimates are about 3 million, and not as much as the United States, which is now 5 million, I believe. But that is a recent development in the United States. Historically, of course, UK had the largest diaspora. More interestingly, we should be aware that the first Indians came to the UK in the 17th and 18th centuries, mainly as what were called lashkars in those days. These were people who both operated the boats and guided the ships, actually, that came from India to the UK and back again. Because the British, though they came to India, did not have the expertise, the seafaring expertise, to actually come to India. So it was Arab seafarers and Portuguese seafarers and Indian seafarers who were key to the ships being able to travel between UK and India. So they were basically people who came, lived here for a very short time, usually between the sailings, and then went back. And there are very interesting records of these people who lived in the UK for these short periods of time, usually in hostels that were maintained by the church, or people connected by the church who were hospitable to these people, made them feel at home and all that before they were sent back to India. Very interesting records of that. But the first named person whose name we know was in the 18th century. He was a Muslim cleric, as well as an ambassador and a writer. He was known as a munshi. And his record of his time in India, in the UK and in France, is actually recorded in Persian and was translated from the Persian into English in 1821, and then was later on, of course, republished. But the second person who came and settled in the UK was a man called Sheikh Deen Muhammad, also Muslim by background, though he became a Christian later on in life. A very interesting man. The first known person to have written a book in English ever, Sheikh Deen Muhammad. And he was, in addition, the first person to establish an Indian restaurant in the UK, the first Indian person to have started a medical facility in the UK, and so on. Very interesting man. So I could talk more about him, but I won't at the moment. So as I've said, about 3 million in the UK at the moment, long history, very well established, obviously Prime Minister and so on, who we've had of Indian origin, loads of members in the House of Lords, loads of members in the lower house of Parliament, very well established business leaders such as Hindujas, Prakashji and so on, who are here. So very well established community in every field. That's UK. The next largest group is in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we have something like 250,000 people. So, but most of them are not directly from India. Most of them have come via Suriname. And I would say 2/3 of the population of people of Indian origin in the Netherlands is of Surinamese origin. But in the whole of Europe, generally speaking, people came and settled there from about the 1950s onwards. Germany is a little bit of an exception to that, because in Germany, people used to come for Sanskrit studies between the two world wars. It is not generally known that the place for the best and most advanced Sanskrit studies in the world between the period of the First and Second World Wars was actually Germany. So if you wanted to study Sanskrit to the highest level, you came to Germany to study Sanskrit, which is very strange, but that's what it was. And earlier than that, again in the 18th century, the very first Indian to have come to Europe to actually study there before returning to India was a Tamil gentleman who studied theology in a place called Halle. Most people don't know where Halle is today, but it was a very important center. And by the way, Thomas, he'll be of interest to you because he studied theology and went back to be a priest and became one of the first founders of the indigenous Indian church in India. So very fascinating characters, mostly Muslims and Christians, which is fascinating in the early period. Now, of course, mostly Hindus. So that's an interesting historical story. I think I'll stop there. There are, of course, populations of Indians in Austria and Spain, in Switzerland and so on, all over Europe. But these are very much smaller populations. The big populations are, of course, in the UK, in the Netherlands, and in Germany. And then everything else is smaller after that. And the general situation of Indians in all over Europe, I would say, is very few racist problems, very well settled, generally speaking, in all fields of endeavor. And I think that's worth reflecting, of course, in the museum, because the history in the United States and Canada and so on is very different, slave origins and so on, or slave-like origins and so on, so indentured labor and all that. The European history is quite different and is worth reflecting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guptara. You mentioned about early migration of Indians in UK. But continental Europe also had some migration. During the Independence Day movement, there was Madame Kama mobilizing Indian independence movement in
Yeah,
France and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose
that's
in
right.
Germany.
Yes.
Any brief insight into this? Because these are important aspects to be considered for the museum.
Indeed. Madame Kama was a very famous lady. She came, of course, from a very distinguished family. All of us know about the Kama Oriental Research Institute and so on, the philanthropic Parsi family. She was from that family. The family supported her when she first came to France and settled there, and actually supported her throughout her time in Paris. But she lived a very simple life. She did not live the life of which she could have done of luxury and so on the basis of the family wealth. And she devoted herself wholly to the independence struggle. So she's generally known as the mother of the Indian independence. The father, of course, is Gandhiji, so to speak, but the mother was Madame Kama. And she was called Madame Kama, of course, because she lived in Paris. She and Savarkar, by the way, the founder of Hindutva, were very close colleagues in the early days, in the time when Savarkar was still a secularist, because Madame Kama was, of course, not a Hindu, she was a Parsi. And her first flag of independence, which she unfurled in Stuttgart at the International Socialist Congress, the very first time an Indian flag had been unfurled at any international occasion, was a very fascinating flag with 8 lotuses for the 8 Indian provinces, because at that time there were 8 provinces in British India. And she had, so that was the top panel. And then the bottom panel was the symbol of a moon and the symbol of a sun, representing, of course, Islam and Hindu. So the phase when Savarkar was still a secularist was very much connected with Madame Kama's work. Now, her work was banned. She was followed. She was spied upon. She was not allowed to travel to various places. She published 2 journals that were to newspapers, journals that were banned, of course, in India, and was surreptitiously circulated both in Britain and in India, and were very important in terms of rousing and mobilizing Indians. So very, very key figure in France. And then Bose, of course, is very well known to all of us. His work in mobilizing support from Germany, and later on, of course, in Singapore, his struggles there are very well known. He succeeded in mobilizing not just the general average Indian, which is what Madame Kama did, but succeeded in rousing people who were in prisoner of war camps in Germany, as well as others, to join him, to actually join the armed struggle from Singapore. And of course, it's a very sad story that we don't know how he died, and the latest books have suggested some reasons why we don't know why he died. And I think it would be very good for the current government and any future governments in India to actually try and unlock the story of why he died and where he died and so on. But anyway, there will be lots of open questions which should also be in the museum, but that's certainly one of them.
Yeah. Well, this is actually a brainstorming session too, what should be there. So I'm glad that in such a short time you condensed all the important aspects of Europe. Now we go